One of our national papers described the rate rise as an inflation SOS. Do you think that the electorate is starting to appreciate the urgency and the emergency around the inflation impact on the economy?
I hope that people understand that inflation is damaging and corrosive, and perhaps the media coverage of our decision last week has reinforced that. I also want people to understand that we're really serious about this. It's not something that we're going to say, oh, well, we'll run the risk and have inflation stay high. It's just too costly, too damaging and corrosive. So I hope that message is getting across to the community. And if inflation expectations can stay well anchored, and at the moment they are, then firms will reflect that in their pricing decisions, and we'll see the same in wage outcomes as well. So if inflation expectation can stay anchored, we can stay on that narrow path, and our communication is partly aimed at reinforcing the need for inflation expectations to stay anchored and convince people that this period of high inflation is only going to be temporary. If we can do that, then we can stay on the narrow path. But if people start to think inflation is going to be 7 and 8% the year after next, then we're going to have all sorts of trouble. I think people understand that now.
Governor, how high will unemployment have to rise to get inflation in check?
That's a very good question, and we really don't know the answer to that at the moment. Our central forecasts have the unemployment rate getting to 4.5% next year, and that being enough broadly to get the inflation rate down to 3% over the next couple of years. If we can do that, that central forecast comes to fruition, it'll be a good outcome for the country, won't it? Because we will have got to 4.5% unemployment, which before the pandemic, the lowest we got to was a bit above 5. But there's a lot of uncertainty around this, and it partly depends upon how wage outcomes develop. If wage outcomes kind of stay in a reasonable ballpark, then I think we can manage this, what I see as a fairly soft landing. We're keeping the unemployment rate below where it was before the pandemic.
What are the risks in regards to that wage dimension that you've just talked about?
Well, one risk would obviously be that people say inflation's 7.8%, I need a 7.8% pay rise, because if that happens, then inflation's going to be high next year, and then we have another high pay rise in the year after that inflation's high, and we're in this nasty world I talked about. So that's one risk. But I think you've got to keep it in perspective at the moment. At the moment, we don't really see evidence of that occurring. We think that the growth in the wage price index will get up to 4%, maybe a bit higher, and probably not go much higher than that. But there are risks here. If we end up in the world I was describing before, where people link wage increases one for one with inflation, then inflation will persist and it'll be more difficult. But at the moment, that's not happening. The enterprise agreements that have been signed over the past 4 or 5 months have bigger wage increases this year, but then next year they're a bit lower again. And we hear this from firms in our liaison as well. They're giving workers a bigger increase this year, but they're saying to their workforce, well, next year we've got to go back to something more modest. I hope that's how it works out. But if it doesn't, we'll have problems.
Governor, you have, in your earlier remarks, talked about the collective and collaborative nature of board discussions and board decisions. Am I right to assume that board decisions are unanimous?
Well, we go around the table each time, and each board member expresses their views, and the experience that I've had as governor is that we all come to the same conclusion. We explore the issues from every angle. Maybe Michelle, you can reflect on it as well, because I'm chairing the meetings, but you're a member, so.
Yeah. Yes, I would. It's a very open discussion. I mean, I've only been involved in it regularly for the last 9 to 10 months, but we go around the room. But before we do that, we have an active discussion about possible options, and I think we've expressed those in some of our press releases as well, post-meeting, that we've mentioned the options we've discussed. I've observed discussions where some people have come in sort of with a particular view and then heard alternative arguments and changed their mind. But my experience personally is that in the end, when we go around the room and everyone is specifically asked, there is a unanimous coming together on what is the best thing to do.
And sometimes the meetings are, I'll say, well, we're really unsure about what the right outcome is, whether we should do A or B, what do you think? And we go around and we collectively work it out, and other times I have a stronger view about the answer should be A, and I'll say that, but I always present to the board the arguments for B as well.
So perhaps we should invite the entire board to appear and not just the chair and the deputy chair of the board.
Well, that would be up to you.
Thank you
but
very
the
much.
board has agreed in the past that for better or worse,
That's right.
I'm the
Make our
spokesman of the
jobs
Board
very
on Monetary
difficult.
Policy. That's what they've agreed, for better or worse. So, as you know, there's a review of the Reserve Bank currently underway, and I expect this will be one of the issues that comes out of that review, how we communicate and the accountability mechanisms, and the things that we should be talking about.
Governor, I think I should ask you the same question they asked the Treasury Secretary, but I asked the Treasury Secretary whether or not fiscal policy was playing a subsidiary role to monetary policy at the moment, and he provided an answer, and you might have seen that. But what's your response to that question?
We covered some of this material before. I think fiscal policy is broadly neutral from a demand management side. The government's saving most of the terms of trade revenue boost, so that's positive. It would be problematic if that were not the case and that money was being recycled back into aggregate demand, but that's not, so I welcome that. And then the other two parts of fiscal policy affecting the prices in some specific sectors and adding to the supply side, and the government has initiatives in both those areas. It's up to others to comment on whether the balance is right, but it's positive they're not recycling the terms of trade revenue, and they do have some measures in the energy market and adding to some flexibility on the supply side in some areas. So always can do more, but from where I sit at the moment, it's not problematic.
This final
If
question, Senator
fiscal policy is neutral, isn't that an opportunity? Doesn't that mean that there are opportunities not being realised?
I mean, so again, at a very high level, you could have more restrictive fiscal policy, and that would take some pressure off aggregate demand. But the difficult
and take pressure off the inflation rate.
perhaps, but I think that one of the difficulties here, and governments right around the world have dealt with this, is the flexibility of fiscal policy to tighten up and loosen up. It's pretty hard. For the government to go through and use fiscal policy in a counter-cyclical way. During the COVID crisis, it was easy. It was clear there was a national emergency, things happened very quickly, but most of the time, if we're talking about trying to reduce aggregate demand by 1%, it's a pretty surgical thing that has to be done, and getting that through the parliament and making all decisions, that's tough for any government. So that has led to the position we're in, where monetary policy is used mainly to manage aggregate demand, and fiscal policy looks to the structural issues. You could have a different setup, but it's hard. The governance of fiscal policy is harder than the governance of monetary policy.